Good evening. For those of you that are here for the first time, welcome to the Baker Institute. If you're a returning guest, welcome back. Thank you for coming tonight and everyone who worked so hard to get this evening organized. Special thanks to Ambassador Dirigian for being here and allowing our group to do what we do. My name is Emmett Walsh. I'm the chair of the Roundtable of Young Professionals here at the Baker Institute. Can I get a show of hands for Roundtable Young Professional members? Great. The Roundtable Young Professionals, or RYP, is a nonpartisan group of Houston-based young professionals dedicated to discussing, debating, and understanding key domestic and foreign policy issues that are of critical importance to current and future generations. Our biggest honor would be to see any guests here tonight join our group, and there is strength in numbers. Please talk to a current member about our group after the event if you're interested in learning more. Tonight, we're here to discuss Hurricane Harvey's impact and what to do in Houston to address increased severity of storms and the potential impact these storms will have on our city, the Gulf Coast, and the U.S. as a whole going forward. These storms destroy residential, commercial, and industrial property that are of vital importance to Houston families as well as the broader U.S. economy. Some families are going through their third iteration of home repair after the Tax Day and Memorial Day floods of April 2016 and May 2015, respectively. So we have no choice but to address this issue or continue to suffer massive losses as a result of increasingly volatile weather. Tonight, we're honored to present scholar Jim Blackburn, who has spent years studying this exact topic as a lawyer, scholar, and a conservationist. Professor Blackburn will give a 25-minute presentation and be interviewed by one of our RYP members. That'll be followed by an audience Q&A and book signing for his latest book, and it's a powerful call to action. Its title is A Texan Plan for the Texas Coast. The RYP member who will be interviewing Jim Blackburn is Kellen Lewis. He's a local entrepreneur and a veteran of the Coast Guard, and was out for days during the storm in the Sanko Ranch and Port Arthur areas, rescuing families from their homes. Jim Blackburn has been practicing has been a practicing environmental lawyer and planner since 1973. He's a professor of the practice of environmental law in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department here at Rice. He is also the co-director of the Severe Storm Prediction, Education, and Evacuation from Disaster, or SPEED Center here at Rice University. Professor Blackburn has authored numerous legal papers and won several awards for his efforts in conservation, including the National Conservation Achievement Award in 2001 from the National Wildlife Federation, as well as the Bob Eckhart Lifetime Achievement Award for Coastal Preservation Efforts from the General Land Office of the State of Texas in 1998. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jim Blackburn.
Okay, let's see if I can get my slide is up. We're started. Thank you very much for having me this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do is kind of very quickly go through just some of the impressions of Harvey, some ideas, some issues, and then I really look forward to having a discussion and talking about it. Let me start by saying I think that Harvey is sort of a turning point, in my opinion, in Houston's history. We've really got one chance to get this right coming out of this storm. We had Allison before it. We've had a series of kind of smaller events, but they were very significant in certain watersheds. But with Harvey, the entire world saw exactly what we all experienced here. It is not a secret that Houston has a flooding problem. It is out there. It's known by everyone, and I think it's up to us to come up with a response to it that shows that we're going to be the leaders in the world in terms of moving forward and understanding the resilience issues that we have today. I think the downside of this is if we don't get this right, I think it will go into an economic decline. Hurricanes are a reality of the Texas coast. This is an image from the book that's outside. This image shows just the lattice of hurricanes that we've had. There was a town called Copano. There was a town called Indianola. Anybody in here heard of those two towns? Yeah, they're no longer around. They were wiped out by hurricanes. They have no future after a hurricane. Galveston got hit in 1900, again in 1915. It was the leading port on the Texas coast. It's no longer that leading port. I would tell you that Galveston, it survives as a town. I would say that as a commercial center, it's long past its peak, and that peak will not return. The question is, will we have the same fate? Now, I want to just put this slide up. If you don't know what watershed you live in Houston, I would suggest that you learn that, because everything's about watersheds and bayous in this town. These are small watersheds. We've got the Brazos River on that side, we've got the San Jacinto River on this side, but these are small watersheds. They respond very quickly to rainfall. So usually we're worried about a 24-hour storm. Harvey was a 4-day event, and so it was a very different type of storm than what we have normally experienced. But every one of these bayous has basically a story of its own, and I don't have anywhere near the time to go through it. But part of solving this problem is going to be coming up with bayou-specific solutions for each one of these, and that's for rainfall events. Now, this is a report by Harris County Flood Control District back in 2000, well, after 2001's event with Allison. How many of you were here for Allison? A lot of rain. Look at the title, Off the Charts. That's Flood Control District's own term for that. Now, the Flood Control District, past director and current director, are climate change deniers. I don't care if we call it climate change or if we call it weird weather. But off the charts is what we're talking about. Not just with Allison, but with certainly Harvey, and with several in between. We're continuing to see a pattern of severe weather events. Those are not going to go away. They will continue. So that's our new normal. We have a new normal, and we haven't even begun to understand what that new normal is. Allison, we had 25, 26 inches of rain over on the east side of town. Didn't rain all that much on the west side of town. Alice was really an east side event. Tax Day flood. That was a northwest event. But look at the scale here. Let me flash up here. Return frequency up in Waller County, way back up in here. They said it was a 10,000-year event. Wow. 10,000-year event. Now, how many of you have heard of a 100-year event? How many of you believe it comes once every 100 years? Now, see, that tells you something when the public laughs at an engineering designation. That tells you that our engineering designation may not be accurate. I trust the public more than engineers on something like that sometimes. But look at these. 10,000, 2,000, 2,500, 1,000, 900, 900-year events on these different watersheds. Over here we're talking about flows. Every one of those bayous set a record in the Tax Day flood. And it was just a norther. That was just a cold front that came in. That wasn't a tropical storm. That was just a rainstorm. And it's a record setter. But not like Harvey. This is the Chronicle's coverage. Pink, 40-plus inches. Nederland over in the Beaumont, Port Arthur area had over 60 inches in 4 days. This is the highest single recorded rainfall event in United States history. There's never been anything like Harvey. Harvey formed in 24 hours. It went from a dead, kind of a remnant tropical storm to a Cat 4 hurricane in just over 24 hours. It was fueled by the hot water of the Gulf of Mexico and the Bay of Campeche. We're talking about the hottest water in the world. We're talking about water that is getting hotter every year. These storms are heat pumps. They take heat out of the ocean. That's where they get their power. If the ocean gets hotter, these storms are going to get more powerful. And the oceans are getting hotter every year. Now, I'll show you this. We have a 500-year flood for 5 minutes. I'm not sure how useful that is to you. Or I'm sorry, that's a 2-year storm for 5 minutes. We have a 500-year storm for 5 minutes. It's, by the way, 1 inch and 4/10. But here's the one I want to point out. Way down here at the bottom, the 500-year storm for a 4-day event is 21 inches. We had 44 inches in Harvey. That doubled the 500-year storm. Now, you're talking about off the charts. That's off the charts. I've heard it said that Harvey was between a 2,000 and a 20,000-year event. But nobody quite knows how to figure this. I will tell you this. This is our planning horizon right there. We're planning all of our watershed, planning all of our floodplain maps are based on 13 inches in 24 hours. That is an obsolete number. Everything we are building today to that standard is obsolete upon construction. You finish construction, it's obsolete. And that's what we're building back to. Other rainfall events, we've had 43 inches in 24 hours, actually back in '79. Anybody remember Tropical Storm Claudette? It was a huge event. Allison's 28. We had a storm we didn't even name, it had 22 inches in 24 hours. We had Francis, had 16 inches, 15, 15, 14, 14. And that was all really prior, up until Allison. My point is, we've got a new normal. It's not going to go away. This is what flooded during Harvey. I would tell you that is probably what we should be looking at as a minimum floodplain going forward. We're working off of the green. The green is the 100-year floodplain. The purple is the 500-year floodplain. I would tell you the 500-year may not be large enough to identify the risk that would be fairly recurrent. Now, I hate to tell you this, we haven't seen the worst storm yet. We've got a storm in our future that's going to come from the Gulf of Mexico, that's going to come a long way. It's going to be like an Irma or a Maria, and it's going to be a Cat 4, high Cat 3. It's going to come ashore, and it's going to have a 20-foot surge at the coast. A 20-foot surge at the coast will go over the Galveston seawall. Seawall's at 17 feet. 20-foot surge at the coast will go over that. Covers all of this up. This is Clear Lake area. There's about 200,000 homes here that'll be inundated, probably 100,000 destroyed beyond repair. And that's the big one. That's the Houston Ship Channel. This is the Bayport Industrial Complex back in here. Both of those will be flooded significantly. That's 25 foot of surge coming up the Houston Ship Channel with a 20-foot surge at the coast because it gets funneled up the ship channel. That would probably be the worst disaster in United States history in many respects. That is a very real part of our future. Up on the ship channel, in red are shown the industry parcels that would be 65% to 100% flooded by that storm. In gold, you have those that are 25 to 65% and 10 to 25%. We've got most of the military-grade jet fuel in the United States is made on the Houston Ship Channel. Likely, you would shut down that jet fuel availability with that storm. You would lose probably 25% of the plastics capacity in the United States, in the world. It would have a huge impact on gasoline prices and availability throughout the United States. And There are 4,400 storage tanks up in that area. Estimates from SPEED Center are 2,200 of those would be flooded to some extent. Many of those would fail, rupture because of the flooding. Estimates are about 90 million gallons of oil and hazardous substances would be released. Exxon Valdez was 10 million. The Deepwater Horizon was 200 million gallons, just to give you some perspective. None of them were into a contained bay system. Galveston Bay would probably be lost for generations. There are things that could be done. There's a proposal to build an dike down here. This would knock down much of this area. The dike is proposed at 17 feet, so you would still have overage along the frontage here, and you would have some residual flooding back up into the upper part of the bay, but only 11 or 12 feet rather than 25 feet. So it's a much, much improved situation. It's a $10 to $15 billion proposal. Another alternative that's proposed is a mid-bay solution that we developed at SPEED Center. That's proposed to 20 feet. It would require raising the seawall to 20 feet. And that protects the west side of Galveston and protects the city of Galveston. It does not protect Chambers County at all. There probably could be additional levees built over in Anahuac area. Those are your two alternatives. I would tell you we're looking at a Jesse Jones moment here. Jesse Jones, back in the 30s, corralled all the lending institutions, brought them in a room together and said, we're not going to let a bank fail in Houston. Basically put together a war chest to bail out any bank that came close to failing. And at least as I've been told, there wasn't a bank that failed in the Houston-Galveston region during the Great Depression, which was really remarkable. But it put Houston on the Houston region on a great financial footing going forward. I tell you, we need someone like that. We need a vision, we need a plan, we need to mobilize the public, and we need to motivate the politicians to do the right thing. And I've got a thought or two about that. This is where the river wall in the Netherlands used to have their dike. The river was restricted to here. They basically bought out all of this area and have moved their dikes back to this area. They made room for the river. They peeled their city back. This is from a country that had basically spent centuries restricting water, and all of a sudden they open it up because it was the better way of handling things. You're not going to control 42 inches of rainfall in 4 days. No city in the world can handle that, but you can manage it. And part of managing is making room for the bayous, making room for the water. So I would tell you that sort of vision one. Vision two, this is the mid-bay alternative that becomes a central destination and organizing place. These solutions we're talking about need to serve the community as well as protect us from flooding. So they need to be basically destinations in and of themselves. People come from all over the world to see the Maeslant Barrier open and close once a year in the Netherlands. It hasn't been deployed very many times at all. So they come to watch it as a tourist attraction. We're talking about possibly having 2 of those gates before it's over. 2 papers I wrote that Ed was kind enough to publish here at the Baker Institute. The first was just about 15 policy points to consider. A more recent alternative or set of alternatives lay out a lot of ideas to talk about. I encourage you to go to the website and read them. I think they will give you some ideas that I think hopefully will be discussed and will be worth carrying forward. These are the houses that flooded during Allison. 74,000 houses flooded during Allison. These are the houses that flooded during the tax day storm in 2016. Here I think we were talking about less than 10,000 houses. With Harvey, I haven't gotten a final total. I've heard somewhere between 100 and 134,000 houses flooded during Harvey. I'm not sure what the number is. We don't have the database yet to show where the flooding occurred. And I really want to see the spatial distribution because it covered a lot of area. Again, watershed by watershed, we're going to have to look at where we have houses that have flooded more than 3 times they need to be bought out. Now, there are some communities that don't want to be bought out. We're going to have to work with those communities. But the worry is we simply cannot protect some of our legacy development that is right next to the bayous. And if we can't protect it, then we should encourage everyone to sell their property. That also means we need to have a fund of money sitting up here ready. Because frankly, most people that got flooded didn't have a lot of choice. Most everybody I've talked to has decided to rebuild because that was the only option they had available. Even if they didn't want to. There was no money to buy them out. FEMA is coming in with buyout money, but only if you have flood insurance, only if you're in the 100-year floodplain, and only if you've been flooded 3 times with insurance. So it's a restrictive group that's covered. Over 50% of our flooding is outside the 100-year floodplain. So by definition, half of our people are eliminated right there. We need to have that fund of money. It's going to be hard to get local government to pass a bond issue to hold money in reserve until the next flood comes along, but we're going to need to do it. I've talked about that. Addicks and Barker, west side of Houston. A lot of people might not have known about Addicks and Barker until we had Harvey. Most everybody knows about Addicks and Barker now. They're the best flooding control investments we've ever made in this part of the world. They were built to protect downtown Houston after the floods of the 30s. There were 2 horrible downtown Houston floods in the 30s, and this land was condemned over in a very controversial condemnation in the 40s, and then these dams were built in the 50s. They're earthen levees. They're almost 70 years old. They are not in good shape. In 2010, this was put out by the Corps of Engineers. I litigated this issue in 2011, and I would promise you most people did not know when Harvey hit that we had 2 of the 6 most dangerous reservoirs in the country in Houston. Did any of you not know that tonight? That 2 of the Addicks and Barker have been identified at being at risk of catastrophic failure, and that risk goes back to 2010. And we didn't get it fixed. We didn't insist as a community. What we insisted on was building the Grand Parkway. So our priority as a community has been about taking care of those who haven't gotten here yet, rather than those that are here. And that's got to change. That is, I think, a central organizing feature of moving forward, is we've got to protect the people who are here. That's not been who we've been worried about. Now, did anybody, I'm going to forget his name, I draw a blank, Jeff with Flood Control District. Who could forget him? I did. Jeff Lidner stood in front of the television screen and said, the Corps of Engineers is getting ready to release 12,000 cubic feet per second of water out of Addicks and Barker combined. Now, who in this room knew what 12,000 cubic feet a second of water meant? I mean, I'm not knocking Jeff. Jeff's job was to go up and deliver the message, and he was probably the best public servant we had during Harvey. I think the world of what he did. But that information was really not real useful, because nobody knew what CFS meant. This is the 500-year floodplain on Buffalo Bayou. It was calculated using 10,000 CFS. The Corps of Engineers released more than a 500-year flood out of Addicks and Barker. Now, they did it because they were scared to death that these reservoirs were going to suffer catastrophic failure. I don't blame them for releasing the water. What happened was better than what would have happened with catastrophic failure. But why are we in a position of having to make those type of choices? I'll tell you one thing, we never had any public discussion about any of this. We didn't talk about it. We didn't know about it as a community. I litigated this issue and I couldn't get any press coverage. I mean, it wasn't something people wanted to talk or hear about. We need a new reservoir. This is Grand Parkway. This is 529 out on the Gady Prairie. We need a holding pond out here because Cypress Creek flows over the watershed divide whenever we get a rain like Harvey, whenever we get a tax day flood, and it flows into Addicks Reservoir. That's one of the real pressures on Addicks. We've got to take care of that. This is a proposal. This has been on the drawing boards. Harris County could have built this 2 years ago. It cost $300 million. Harris County did not want to go to the voters and ask for a bond issue for $300 million to build this reservoir. It would have made a big difference. This is Addicks. This is the extent of government-owned land. I think that's the golf course and these are recreation facilities. These are homes. Elevation 102, 103, 104, these colors gradate. This reservoir is higher than 109 feet with the levee. We did not buy enough land for the levee we built. So when Harvey came along, started filling the reservoir up, and it flooded all of these houses, here and in Barker. The people that lived there did not know they were in the flood pool of a reservoir. Period. We don't help our people very much. I think we need to fix Addicks and Barker. We need to move forward and at least get a permit to build this mid-bay alternative. It can be built for $3 billion. We can afford that with local money. Everybody says the federal government's going to come through with 10 to 15 billion for the Ike Dike. Fine. If they want to build the Ike Dike, I'm happy for them. We need something. But we need an insurance policy. So I want to go get a permit to build that right now, although Jim Blackburn really can't go get that permit. Harris County needs to go get that permit tomorrow. And we need high quality information. Every buyer should get an Understanding Houston flooding brochure. We don't tell our people the truth about flooding. This is my favorite slide of the whole presentation. This was up in the Bay Area. Did anybody happen to see this? You had to be quick. It only lasted a month. This is like you drive up to the intersection and you look over to your left and you see this. This is how high the flood would come in a Category 4 hurricane with surge flooding. And that's how high it goes in Category 5. And you know, you're sitting there looking, you know, wow, man, that's high. Guess why we removed it? Realtors. Complaints. You know what the complaint was? Well, God, we can't sell any homes with this information. That's my point. People, if they have good information, make good decisions. But if you move here from Iowa, from the Midwest somewhere, a place that's not used to hurricanes, you know, West Coast, you don't know about hurricanes. You don't know what questions to ask. We need to take care of our people. The medical center has a warning system designed by Phil Bediend over here in Civil and Environmental Engineering. And it's easier for me to explain it off of this next slide. This is Ike coming ashore. This is real-time at that point in time, real-time radar imagery of the flood band or the rain bands coming in. They could estimate rainfall intensity from that. And then over here you have the bayou. And they have all of these gauges. You see all these gauges on the bayou? Well, that gives you printouts about what the bayou's doing in terms of flow. The medical center after Allison got floodgates on every one of their underground structures. And there's a phone call that'll come from Rice and will tell the medical center, shut the floodgates. And that's when the medical center closes down, basically turns into a turtle, and waits for the storm to be over. The people that are there stay. Calls are made to everybody that works there that isn't there, don't come. And that was a total private sector enterprise done by the medical center. We need one of those for all of Harris County. Every watershed should have a flood warning system. It's not that hard. It could be done in 4 months. So, this is the best I've come up with for the name of a new nonprofit. I've had some thoughts and comments about it. But I think, that a private sector organization needs to be pulled together to frankly force the county, force the city, force our politicians to do the right thing. To basically be a group that is watchdogging everything we do about recovery and with basically long-term flood resilience in Houston. So a nonprofit will be formed. I think it is in the process of being incorporated as I talk. It will hopefully create a vision network. It will establish a network of hopefully 100,000 people. Hopefully a lot of the people that have been flooded will be part of this. And will basically be a network to call upon, to let people know what issues are out there and what things need to be done. And who to talk to about getting those things done. We don't have any nonprofit like this in the town. It may not last long. It doesn't need to last long if we get this done. This is not a lifetime institution. This is a very targeted institution. Funding, we can try to ensure funding for specific projects, sufficient money for buyouts, getting a flood warning system done, getting flood information, and preparing the surviving Houston flooding document and circulating it. A group called Outreach Strategist has been retained to basically provide the infrastructure to get the organization that can be in touch with 100,000 people by February put together and pulled together. If you want to be part of the nonprofit, we're soliciting members. My email address at Rice, you'll be happy to know that Rice won't let you have but 8 letters in your email address. So my address is blackburr@rice.edu. Send me an email if you want to get involved, and that concludes the kind of organized part of this presentation. Thank you for having me.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks.
Good.
So Emmett and I prepared a couple questions, which many of them you answered during your presentation, so thanks a lot for that. But first, I kind of see the road to recovery or preparedness as kind of a two-part deal, where we have a short term, obviously, because I think you, as you stated pretty clearly, that these probably aren't 500-year storms. We could have another one of these in the next few years. So it seems to me that we should probably to do whatever we can to be prepared for something like this to happen again in 10 years, possibly, and then have another plan for the future. And as we know, government seems to move pretty slowly, and a lot of the ideas that you have presented, in my opinion, seem like they may be 15 to 20 years from being implemented or finished. Does that seem accurate to you, or how long would it take to build, a 20-foot seawall?
Well, I mean, the big structural alternatives,
right,
they take longer. The Ike Dike will probably take 20 years to build.
Right.
The Mid-Bay alternative could be built probably within a 5 to 7 year time period, assuming you had your permits in order. So that's the one that could be done the quickest. But many of the things for rain, and that's really surge flooding, and that one scares me to death, and we've got to do something about it, and that's why I want to go and get a permit. We could get a permit next week. We could, you could put a permit application together in 3 months and file it, and it'll take the Corps of Engineers a year or two, and you can spend that time gathering the money. If the feds were to go ahead and fund the Ike Dike, you don't have to build something just because you got a permit for it. But I want to see that type of action taking place. That gives us something solid that we can fall back on. We can raise $3 billion with the bond issue. It would be tough. You'd have to have the community behind and make sure everybody understood the need for it. And so there's going to be a need for a whole lot of public outreach and interface with something like that. I mean, like I said, the Netherlands has a national flood tax. The Netherlands believes that taking care of flooding is a national security issue. Flooding is a regional security issue here in the Houston-Galveston region, and we just don't talk about it that way. I think we've done ourselves a disservice by putting it under the table. Many of the things on bayou flooding, that can be done much more quickly. The big buyout will come with the next big flood. So the key there is to have the money ready. And frankly, concepts, have it worked out. There's a lot of social issues about buyouts. Where do the people go? Where is the redevelopment going to take place? Are we going to gentrify much of the community? I mean, there's a lot of issues. Meyerland doesn't want to be bought out because it's a tight Jewish community. There's a lot of concern about what happens to the community if there is a massive buyout. It's a legitimate concern. We're going to try to do computer modeling to understand everything we can do to try to get Braze controlled to some extent. But what that looks like, I mean, right now there's something called Project Brace you can't find a map for. We need to get good information about all of these alternatives and frankly have a human face on all of this. Mm-hmm. Those are some ideas, but I think that we can do a lot quickly. Information, we can get information out in 6 months. Flood warning system, 6 months.
So that the information is a good point. So I haven't seen anything yet. I don't know if you have. Have you seen any data about the integrity of the Addicks or Barker Reservoir since the storm? I mean, if this were to happen again, you know, how has their integrity been affected? You know, if we have something like half as big as Harvey, do you see this having a catastrophic failure?
Well, I don't know that it would be any worse than what we went through. I mean, they didn't fail, so I think that was certainly the good news.
Right.
And I think that the fact that, well, one, we have tried to get information about how the computation was made that these two reservoirs were 2 of the 6 most dangerous in the United States. That is it's essentially an algorithm where they multiply a risk factor times a population at risk. And there's a lot of people at risk with this dam, or with these dams. So you've got a lot of people here, so the risk factor is probably lower than it is with some dams in other parts of the country that don't have as many people around. We can't get that risk factor number. I have been unable to get it in any of the public documents that I've gotten hold of. I would like to see, frankly, a congressional hearing to go into how Addicks and Barker got to be in the condition they're in, how they were handled, and what needs to be done going forward. But I can't answer that question. I do not know how risky those dams are. I do know that there is concern about voids. There's concern about fissures. They are replacing the gates on those dams. That is being done. But that will not remove the DSAC 1 certification, which is the classification among the most dangerous.
And just one more question from us, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So kind of going back to your point about development and preparedness, living in harmony, do you see a way forward to continue development, whether it's residential, commercial, but also do that in harmony with preparing for floods? Do you see the Houston public coming on board with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Fort Bend County has stricter drainage regulations than Harris County does, and they came through Harvey much better. They had roughly the same amount of rainfall. They had a bad problem on the backside of Barker, but that's not their problem. That's not their fault. They had a failure of an engineering design in one of the levied subdivisions. But by and large, Fort Bend County came through Harvey with amazingly little damage compared to how much Harris County had. And I think it's the difference in the type of drainage regulations. It's at least a piece of that. So I think we can have more stringent regulations. Fort Bend County, I think, was among, if not the fastest developing county in the United States, among the certainly top 10. So I don't think the argument that you're going to stop development with more stringent regulations is all that valid.
Thank you so much. So I guess we'll turn it over to the audience. We'll go over here, and I'll just let you guys pass the mic around.
Well, I guess you suggested that there was a pretty strong need for a third reservoir out sort of in the Cypress area. if the willpower existed for, say a year from now, getting the bond money raised, what would be the timeline for how quickly that could get done? And would that require a lot of eminent, like how many existing houses would need to be eminent domained?
That is basically undeveloped land. So not many houses would be eminently domained, or I guess is that how you say it?
Yeah, whatever the verb is. We know what you mean.
Anyway, they wouldn't be condemned, I think would be the way to say it. I don't think you worry about a lot of houses there. It's private property. I think you'd be talking about ranch land. Katy Prairie Conservancy owns about half the land. And I think they would be paid. I think they're a little worried about how long the water would be held in that dam. And I've heard some concern about the design of it, but by and large, it's undeveloped property in the sense of subdivisions. It is property that is certainly used for native prairie and for grazing.
Mayor Turner has asked the former president of Shell Oil, Marvin Odom, to become some kind of czar for flooding in Houston. What are his responsibilities?
I'm not sure I totally understand what his responsibilities are. We also have a flood czar, who's Steve Costello, and I was introduced to the housing czar, a guy named Billy Baldwin. It's not clear to me how the responsibilities are split up among those three. I think that if Marvin Odom is given enough of a leash, I think he is a man that could possibly be very, very helpful in moving forward. I think we need to move outside of city government to find some of the leadership, and I think he has a lot of the qualities I would look for. So I would hope he's being given a kind of a full kind of throttle to go forward and to do what needs to be done. I'm not sure that he has.
What do you see as the tradition, the political culture of no zoning in Houston as being a unique hurdle to overcome, or do you think that it's not that significant?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that zoning would be all that helpful as a solution. I think the biggest problem I see with no zoning is that there's a culture of public participation that comes with zoning. And we don't have a culture of public participation in the Houston, Harris County region. Has anybody ever been to Harris County Commissioners Court? I mean, they approve about 500 items in about a minute and a half. There's no real public discussion at all. I mean, we don't have a real tradition of public discourse. Flooding, we don't ever really talk policy issues to the public about flooding. All that's handled behind closed doors, mainly by the county. The city has been totally absent from the flooding discussion, in my opinion, for decades, basically leaving it to the county. And all of that's done behind closed doors. So I think that's where I would say that no zoning has hurt us, because so much of zoning involves public hearings, public discussions, a lot of things like that. And I just don't think we have the tradition that a lot of the zone cities do, but not because of zoning per se, but because of the public participation.
That's a good segue into my question for you.
Thank you.
In your list of objectives or functions of the new nonprofit, it struck me that one major item was left out, and that is transparency of public officials and public communication discourse. All the things you've been talking about.
Well, I should add it, shouldn't I?
I think you should. I think it'd be a great thing to do.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
I wonder if you could share with us, is there information on the number of deaths that would have arisen from catastrophic failure of either the Addicks or Barker Reservoir? And the second thing is, one of the things that we're blessed with in Houston is a tremendous pipeline infrastructure. It does seem to me that one way, and I've not seen this anywhere, one way to handle flooding is to develop water pipelines from the various regions and run the water out to the Gulf. I wonder if that's been any part of the thought process.
Well, I think for starters, I have tried to get, I have got a copy of a map that the Corps of Engineers prepared about what the flooding would look like if there was massive failure or catastrophic failure of Addicks and Barker. And it covers pretty much the entire Buffalo Bayou and Brays Bayou watersheds. They don't want that map released. They have asked me not to release it. They have basically said because of Homeland Security issues, they'd rather not have that out. And, you know, I'm just reporting what was asked of me. And so in the answer to your question about deaths, I don't know. It would not surprise me to figure that we're talking tens of thousands of people potentially. It could be a horrific event. Now, that's assuming that the levees, that the dams are full when one or both levees break. I wouldn't think both reservoirs would breach at the same time. It would be one or the other, but they hold a lot of water. I mean, we were releasing a 500-year flood down Buffalo Bayou, and it was just the gates. It wasn't a breach. So you could have a lot of water in a hurry. And it's really, I mean, what makes a surge so bad is it comes kind of all at once. It's more like a wave than it is a slow, gradual rise. And I think you'd be looking more at a wave type of situation with that flood. So you would have houses basically destroyed and then used as battering rams against other houses. And that's what you get in a surge. And that's where your horrible kind of life, you know, the type of damage that kills people. The second question I forgot. Oh, the pipelines to the Gulf. We don't have a lot of slope. So one of the problems you've got is trying to get, you know, you're not going to probably do it by gravity. So that means you're going to have massive pumps. And I think probably more than anything, you'd get storage underground. But I think there's probably cheaper storage to be gotten by, frankly, just building reservoirs out west for all the watersheds where we have land left. I think you may see some golf courses condemned. I think, again, just to be, you know, take land, dig it out, and hold water there could be really, really good. If you're a golf player, sorry to tell you that. Yes, well, I guess, where's the microphone?
Over here. So my question is about how we build or how we rebuild. I remember reading that the city of Houston passed an ordinance or tried to pass an ordinance in the past that would have forbidden new construction in the floodway or maybe it was any construction, but the people who are already located there argued that that was a taking of their land because they were already there. So the city retracted the ordinance. So I guess my question is, as an attorney, like, what is your view on what can be done to, like you mentioned, our legacy development? And besides buyouts, is there anything that we can really do to people who are already in an area that's going to continually flood?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of times we pick and choose which things we're worried about being sued about. So I think that I would tell you that there was a strong policy initiative behind the decision not to force that floodway issue. I mean, a buyout, I mean, basically taking a property without due process of law is a buyout. You know, you basically are buying someone out. If you deny a permit, they say, well, you took all my property away, then basically the remedy, if they win in court, is you pay them. But you can, you know, you might get the property in the process. Might as well go ahead and condemn it. So I mean, I'm just saying, I think you can be much more aggressive from a legal standpoint than we have been. I tend to be an aggressive attorney. I'm not particularly worried about making people mad. I think you've got to come up with a plan, and sometimes it's hard to come up with an absolutely fair plan, but if you're transparent, if you lay out your principles, and I mean, you know, if we're looking at homes that we cannot protect, and we're looking at people having, I mean, you know, you got to ask at some point, why should we ask our emergency responders time after time after time to put their life at risk to save the same people that refuse to move? I mean, there's a point at which we have, I think, a right as a society to say, you know, you're really, you know, this is too dangerous to maintain. Now, that's what a city's about. That's what government's about, but it's tough. I might not be elected, so. And I think that's what scares a lot of politicians. And so we find that we go a course where we don't take risk. And I don't think we'll, frankly, come out of this without taking some pretty significant risk. And I think risk-taking is called for in a very well thought out manner. And that may include risk getting sued. Oh, there you are. Yes.
So when you've talked about buyouts, you said that that money would start being allocated now, but wouldn't happen until the next big flooding. So in the meantime, what do you see as the recovery process for neighborhoods that, like, it seems like their only option is rebuilding? Do you see any alternative to that, or it's just rebuilding knowing that they'll probably get flooded again?
I think most everybody I've talked to that is rebuilding, that is in sort of, I'd say that is kind of deep into the floodplain. I think they all think they're going to flood again. I think they just don't see an alternative. You've got a mortgage, you know, you're kind of looking at a $100,000 mortgage. You've got payments you've got to make. You're going to walk away in default and lose your credit rating. You know, you've got to have cash to go buy something else, you know, make a down payment. Not a lot of people can do that. So I think the system forces you back. And so I think there's a lot of people that would like the opportunity to be bought out. But I think also that if we had that fund available and if the money were available the week after the flood, it would make all the difference in the world. And that's not going to happen without forethought and without planning, because you just don't have $2 billion lying around to buy out a lot of houses. And we're talking about buying out $2 billion worth of houses at least. There may be, frankly, $2 to $4 billion of houses to be bought out behind Addicks and Barker alone. And I've heard 13,000 houses back there.
If you don't mind, let me add on something to that. So just from driving around in a boat on people's yards for 4 days, from what I saw firsthand, a lot of the homes that flooded were older homes not built to a newer code. And then especially the first neighborhood that I was in was the Timber Grove area. Kind of in the heights on the White.
Yeah, I know Timber Grove.
So a lot of the homes that I saw that flooded there were older homes, but the newer builds would have zero water in them. So do you think that a short-term solution could be, and it seems like something that could probably pass fairly easily with bipartisan support, would be just new building regulations for the people that had to rebuild? Couldn't that be something that we could work on to get new building codes just for people that are going to have to rebuild, because like you said, that's their only option?
Are you talking about elevation?
Elevation, right.
Well, it's hard to elevate a lot of these structures that are at slab on grade. You're going to have to pump them up, and
90% of the homes in the Heights area, the water in the White Oak Bayou are pier and beam.
if they're pier and beam, then you've got a much easier starting point, and you can do that much more. I think many of the people are doing that where they have those options. I think the harder issues, and again, many of these areas were not in the floodplain. For example, behind Addicks and Barker, many of those people were not even in a 100-year floodplain, and so they didn't know that they were below the flood elevation. So when those homes were built, I mean, you know, the developers didn't build them, you know, to an elevation. I think there's one key. Well, there's three keys to development in Houston: elevation, elevation, and elevation. Any house can flood if it's built flat with the crown of the street, just period. And so if you're looking to buy a house, I mean, I live north of Rice up in Southampton, in that area, and almost every house is about 3 to 4 feet above the street. The streets flood, goes over the top, comes into the yards, and it goes up the side of an incline. And that's the way they were built 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 years ago. And I think where you find new development that's flat with the street, you'll see flooding, because our streets are our secondary drainage system. How many of you knew that? The word's getting out. Everybody should know that. That's part of that book I'm talking about getting, is you just know that those streets, you know, everybody should know which streets are passable near their homes in high water. Some streets you can navigate. Probably the older streets do better than the newer streets do, just as a broad general proposition, because they're going to be on the ridge lines.
Given the risk of a storm surge going up the ship channel, I would assume that the petrochemical industry, the liability for them is orders of magnitude beyond $3 billion. Why are they not stepping up to help pay for that?
several interesting kind of responses to that. One is, I think that they're all very hesitant to identify publicly that there is a risk that they are concerned about. Because I think then the finger will be pointed at them saying, well, if you know there's a risk and you didn't do anything, you were negligent, weren't you, for not doing it. So it's almost a public admission of negligence to make that admission. Generally, they don't like to invite you to tax them. So that would be the second part, because the next thing anyone's going to say, well, if you need it, why don't you pay for it? And I mean, I can't tell you how many citizens I've had to say that. I think that we need to find a way to spread it out with both industry and the citizenry sharing. I think that, I mean, I started off trying to just solve the problem for the ship channel. I thought industry would jump at it, but you know, for $2 billion, you can just build a gate right there at the Fred Hartman Bridge, and we've got 25 feet of elevation on either side of that bridge. So you could just basically just put a right across there. And the industry didn't like that because it didn't protect their workers, and I respect that. And I mean, I have arrows all over my body from going down and talking in League City and Morgan's Point and LaPorte, and telling them that we want to protect the ship channel, but we don't have anything to offer you. That didn't go over very well at all. That was my first lesson as a researcher here. We can do better than that. But those industries do need to protect the people that work in those plants. If the people can't get to the plants can't operate. And I think they found that out during Harvey, because I think several of them were shut down not for flooding in the plant so much as that the workers couldn't get there. But I think that Lloyd's of London, I think the reinsurance industry may be the key to really getting the industry to step forward. I think those reinsurers, because most of the industries, as I understand it, self-insure to several $100 million. And then they'll buy basically an umbrella policy. You know, I mean, how many of you buy a $300 million deductible? But I mean, that's sort of what we're talking about, where your major insurer would kick in. I can guarantee you they are very interested. And so that will be where the pressure will come from.
Sorry, just to add one more thing to that.
One more question to be respectful for everyone's time.
To my knowledge, yeah, we got a game to catch, right?
Yeah.
Anybody know the score? Anybody know the score? 1-0. Thank you very much. Us? Astros? All right, that's what I'm talking about. Hey, there we go. Oh yeah. Perfect. All right, yeah, we gotta wrap this. We gotta wrap this up.
Okay. Well, that was a conversation breaker.
So, as an oil company owner and a guy that owns a lot of tanks on the water, I'll be your huckleberry here. To my knowledge, during Harvey, Houston didn't suffer any catastrophic tank failures. Port Arthur didn't suffer any catastrophic tank failures. There were no barges running aground, ships running aground, to my knowledge. So I would just. I believe they did.
There were a few events.
There was a chemical plant up in Dayton.
The tanks, the tank problems that I've heard about were because of rainfall coming on the floating tanks, and a lot of benzene, a lot of volatiles were released when the tanks, kind of shifted and I'd say failed in that regard just because there was so much rain. But I think you're dealing right. Harvey wasn't a surge storm. We did not have surge up the Houston Ship Channel with Harvey. So if there's one thing you're fortunate about, that was it. I mean, that's the storm I'm most worried about.
Understood. So I got one more question and we'll get out of here.
I guess to bring us back to the beginning of your presentation, to what extent is addressing climate change part of your vision for Houston?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky issue, and it's one I think, frankly, I can have a wonderful climate change discussion with any oil company here in town, but I can't have it with a politician. So it's very interesting. It's the political discourse rather than sort of the industry discourse that's the problem. I think the biggest problem I see with not honestly talking about climate change is we've got weather that's changing. And to call it weird weather, that doesn't do justice to what's coming in the future. And so you kind of, I mean, we're in the process of seeing the floodplains or the 100-year rainfall amounts, the 10,000-year rainfall amount, updated with our new storms. But if you don't have climate change into the picture, you stop there. And we don't know where that profile is going without making some sort of projection of how the climate is changing. So I see that's where we're hurting ourselves without having the climate change in the discussion. I can't tell you, after I wrote the first paper for the Baker Institute published, the one comment I got time and time again, Blackburn, please don't talk about climate change. You're doing really good. You got 15 good points in that paper. Don't talk about climate change. Because it's sort of like putting a red cape in front of a bull. I mean, there are some people that are just going to rise to it. But I'll tell you, it's just almost crazy that we cannot have a science-based discussion about the biggest issue facing the future of our region. And so I think from that standpoint, it's going to be an important roadblock. I think trying to work smartly through it, trying to get as much consensus as quick as we can to move forward on the things that are easy, and then we're going to have to come back to these harder issues. Hurricanes in the future. I mean, industry, I'll come back to the industry, the third piece of that. To a person, and then this is truthful, every one of them would tell me, we've never had a storm anywhere close to a 25-foot surge coming up the Houston Ship Channel. I mean, the industry's protected to about 15, 16 feet out there, and that's all we've ever seen historically. And, I was saying, I talk about, modeling and this and that, you can model anything. You can make those models sing if you want to make them sing. I mean, and there's truth to all of those statements. I've seen it done. I would like to tell you I've never done it, but with climate change, we're talking about those storms getting bigger in the future. If we had modeled Harvey, they would have said we were fear-mongers, we're crazy. No storm would ever do that. It did it. So we've got Harvey as that type of benchmark, but we don't have that surge benchmark. And that's what's the biggest worry I've got about not accepting climate change and realizing we're looking at Marias and Irmas and plus. I mean, I think, was it Maria, they almost came up with a Category 6. And we've never had a Cat 6. We're going to have a Cat 6. So that's what climate change is. That heat is just going to keep going. So I think we've got to deal with it sooner or later. I think it'll hurt us until we do. But I think we can do a lot and skirt the issue and, frankly, not bring the bull out of the closet.
A big round of applause for you. Thank you all for coming. We have an event in November or early December. We haven't decided on a date yet, but everyone will get an email, and I think it'll be on this topic too, because it's something that we should all take a closer look at. But let's get to 100,000 names. All right. Thank you. Have a good night. Go Astros.